My name is Kirill, and I am a ghost runner. That's the slang we use in the gig economy for couriers who handle the deliveries no one else wants. High security complexes, abandoned industrial zones, and those sprawling glass and steel residential towers that look like vertical labyrinths. I don't ask what's in the packages. I just care about the rating and the pay. It was a Tuesday, the kind of day where the sky is the color of a bruised lung, heavy, gray, and suffocating. The app pinged with a priority black delivery. The payout was 3 times my daily average. The pickup was a small, vacuum-sealed cooler from a clinical lab, and the drop-off was the Aethelgard Heights, a brand-new, ultra-modern skyscraper that sat on the edge of the city like a jagged tooth. As I rode my bike toward the building, I felt a strange prickle on the back of my neck. The Aethelgard was massive, finished in reflective black glass that seemed to swallow the dim sunlight. There were no lights in the windows, no people entering or leaving. It was a monument to silence. I walked into the lobby. The air was frigid, smelling intensely of ozone and expensive floor wax. The concierge desk was empty, a single silver bell sitting on the marble surface. I didn't ring it. I headed straight for the elevators. My phone screen flickered as I approached the gold-plated doors, the GPS signal dropping to 0. Floor 44. Suite 4404, the app instructed. I stepped into the elevator. It was a cage of mirrors and brushed chrome. I pressed the button for 44. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. The light didn't turn on. I tried 43, 45, the lobby. Every button felt dead, like pressing my finger against a cold stone. Then I saw it. At the very bottom of the panel, beneath the braille for the basement, was a button I hadn't noticed before. It was a flat, matte black circle with no number. Just a 0 carved so deep into the plastic it looked like a puncture wound. Before I could think, my finger moved. I didn't even mean to press it. It was as if the button exerted a gravitational pull. Click. The elevator didn't move up. It didn't move down. It moved sideways. I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach, the kind you get when a car hits a dip at high speed. The lights in the elevator didn't flicker. They turned a bruised, sickly violet. The mirrors on the walls began to warp, my reflection stretching out until I looked like a skeletal, elongated version of myself. The doors opened with a sound like a wet lung exhaling. I stepped out, expecting a hallway of luxury apartments. Instead, I stood in a concrete wasteland. The floor was raw, unfinished cement, wet in patches with a thick, translucent slime. There were no walls, only massive, square support pillars that vanished into a ceiling so high it was lost in a thick, artificial fog. The air was hot and tasted of wet copper and old sweat. "Hello," I called out. My voice didn't echo. It was swallowed instantly by the vastness of the space. I looked back at the elevator, but the doors were already closing. I lunged for them, but they shut with a finality that made my blood run cold. There was no call button on this side, just a blank concrete pillar where the controls should be. I was trapped on a floor that shouldn't exist. I started walking, my boots splashing in the slime. I needed to find a stairwell. I turned on my phone's flashlight, the beam cutting through the fog. That's when I saw the first construction detail. Propped up against a pillar was a human ribcage, but it was 3 meters wide. It had been reinforced with steel rebar, the bone and metal fused together in a grotesque display of biological engineering. Further down, I found a pile of what looked like oversized bricks. When I got closer, I realized they weren't bricks. They were perfectly rectangular blocks of compressed human hair and teeth. Clang, clang, clang. The sound came from the darkness ahead. It was the rhythmic strike of a hammer against metal, but between each strike, there was a wet, tearing sound. Is someone there? I shouted, my hand shaking so hard the flashlight beam danced wildly. The hammering stopped. From behind a massive pillar, something began to emerge. At first, I thought it was a crane or a piece of heavy machinery. But then I saw the skin. It was a creature made of raw, red muscle, standing nearly 4 meters tall. Its arms were long, multi-jointed hydraulic pistons tipped with rusted iron hammers. Its head was a jagged block of concrete with a single, glowing red eye slit in the center. It wasn't building a skyscraper. It was building a tomb. The creature turned toward me, the eye slit pulsing with a rhythmic, heartbeat-like glow. It didn't have a mouth, but a speaker mounted on its chest crackled to life. Raw material detected. A distorted, feminine voice whispered through the static. Floor 0 requires more mortar. Your marrow will suffice. I turned and bolted into the fog, the sound of the creature's heavy, hydraulic footsteps booming behind me like a drumbeat of death. I had to find a way out, but in this infinite, unfinished labyrinth, the only thing certain was that I was no longer the courier. I was the delivery. That my lungs felt like they were filled with hot sand as I sprinted through the endless forest of concrete pillars. Each step echoed with a sickening squelch against the slime-coated floor. Behind me, the rhythmic, metallic thudding of the architect grew louder. The creature didn't run. It moved with a mechanical, relentless efficiency, its hydraulic limbs hissing as it adjusted its path toward the heat of my body. The violet fog ahead of me began to thin, revealing a strange, flickering light. I scrambled toward it, hoping for a stairwell or a service door. Instead, I stumbled into what looked like a grotesque workshop. Racks of iron hooks hung from the ceiling, but they weren't holding tools. They were holding sheets of human skin, stretched thin like parchment, drying under the hum of high-voltage ultraviolet lights. Below them, vats of a thick, gray slurry bubbled. I looked closer and saw fragments of fingernails and bits of clothing floating in the mix. This wasn't just construction. It was a recycling plant. The Aethelgard Heights wasn't being built with materials from the outside. It was being grown from the people who disappeared into the zero button. Help! The voice was so thin, so fragile, that I almost missed it over the sound of my own thundering pulse. I swung my flashlight toward a massive support pillar nearby. My stomach did a violent somersault. A man was fused into the concrete. Or rather, he was becoming the concrete. From the waist down, his body had been replaced by a square block of gray, stony material that merged perfectly with the pillar. His torso was exposed, his skin a translucent, sickly white, crisscrossed with glowing red wires that acted like artificial veins. One of his arms had been replaced by a long, serrated saw blade made of bone. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Doesn't matter," the man gasped. His eyes were wide and milky, devoid of pupils. "I was a courier too. 3 months ago. 3 years. The time is circular here. I am Unit 709. I am the internal support. I have to get out of here. Where's the exit?" I grabbed his shoulder, but his skin felt like cold, wet clay. He let out a rattling, wet laugh that ended in a cough of gray dust. "There is no exit, boy. The building is a closed loop. It's an organism. We're the cells. You're a fresh protein. The architect. It needs your calcium for the ceiling." Behind us, the heavy clang of the creature's hammer struck a nearby pillar. It was close, maybe 50 meters away. "There has to be a way," I yelled, desperation turning into a cold, sharp anger. "I'm not becoming a fucking wall." Unit 709 looked at me with a flicker of something resembling pity. "The service vent behind the vats. It leads to the ventilation lungs. But the air there is toxic. It will burn your throat, but it might lead to the elevator shaft. If you can climb." "Thank you," I said, turning to run toward the bubbling vats. "Wait," the man-pillar called out. He reached out with his human hand, his fingers unnaturally long. If you see a woman in a white dress, don't look at her eyes. She's the inspector. She decides which parts of US are structural. I didn't stay to ask more. I dove behind the vats of gray slurry. The smell was unbearable, the scent of a dental office mixed with a slaughterhouse. I found the vent, a heavy iron grate held in place by rusted bolts. With a burst of frantic, terrified strength, I kicked it. Once, twice. On the third kick, the metal groaned and buckled inward. As I crawled into the dark, narrow tunnel, I heard the architect reach the workshop. I heard the sound of its hydraulic pistons firing, and then a scream that was cut short by the wet sound of a hammer hitting soft tissue. Unit 709 was no longer structural. The vent was narrow, the metal walls slick with a foul-smelling condensation. I crawled on my belly, the cooler bag still strapped to my chest. My phone's battery was down to 12%. The light flickered, illuminating the tunnel ahead. It wasn't empty. Hundreds of small, pale creatures, the size of rats, but with human faces and tiny, grasping hands, were scurrying along the pipes. They didn't attack. They just watched me with wide, unblinking eyes, whispering in a language that sounded like the static on a dead radio station. Fresh mortar, they whispered. New bricks, new bones. I pushed past them, the toxic air beginning to sting my eyes and throat, just as Unit 709 had warned. The tunnel began to tilt upward. I was climbing into the lungs of the building, but as I reached a small junction, I saw something that made me freeze. A woman was standing at the end of the shaft. She wore a pristine white dress that seemed to glow in the darkness. Her back was to me. She was humming a lullaby, and in her hand, she held a long, silver needle. The inspector. I remembered the warning. Don't look at her eyes. I pressed my face against the cold, vibrating metal of the vent floor, squeezing my eyes shut so tightly that patterns of red and purple danced across my vision. The inspector's humming was beautiful and terrifying, a melodic, crystalline sound that felt like it was vibrating inside my very skull. Every fiber of my being wanted to look up to see the face of the woman in the white dress, but the image of Unit 709's petrified, milky eyes kept me anchored in the dark. The air in the shaft was thick and humid, smelling of old copper and ozone. I could hear the clink of her silver needle against the metal walls as she moved. It sounded like a doctor prepping a syringe. Structural defect detected, she whispered. Her voice wasn't human. It sounded like several voices speaking in perfect, eerie unison. A loose thread in the tapestry of floor 0. Where are you hiding, little cell? I held my breath until my lungs burned. The scurrying creatures with human faces, the scavengers, began to crawl over my legs, their tiny, damp hands patting my clothes. They were silent now, as if they too feared her gaze. One of them crawled onto my neck, its miniature face pressing against my ear. It smelled like wet earth. Don't breathe. The tiny creature breathed into my ear. She stitches the breath away. The humming grew louder, then slowly began to fade as the rhythmic clink-clink moved further down the ventilation branch. I waited for what felt like an hour, my body locked in a cramp before I dared to open my eyes. The white glow was gone. I was alone in the suffocating dark. I continued to crawl, the incline of the vent becoming steeper until it was almost vertical. I was climbing toward the lungs. As I pushed through a heavy rubber flap at the end of the tunnel, I emerged into a chamber that defied every law of physics and architecture. The room was vast, a cathedral of pulsing, translucent pipes that looked like giant arteries. They were rhythmic, expanding, and contracting with a wet, heavy thud that shook the entire building. Thump, 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 thump. This was the heart of Aethelgard Heights. The walls weren't made of concrete here. They were a mesh of calcified bone and purple muscle. In the center of this biological engine stood the elevator, but it wasn't a metal box on cables. It was a massive, vertical esophagus, a tube of pink, glistening flesh that stretched from the floor into the infinite darkness above. It was lined with thousands of vibrating, hair-like cilia. Beside it sat a control console made of teeth and ivory. "This can't be real," I whispered, my voice lost in the thunderous heartbeat of the room. "It's realer than the world you left behind," a voice rasped. I spun around, my flashlight beam landing on a figure huddled beneath a mass of pulsing tubes. It was a woman, or what used to be one. She was wearing a tattered courier uniform, the same brand as mine. Her legs had been fused into the floor, and a series of thin, transparent tubes were inserted into her spine, pumping a glowing blue fluid into the building's veins. "I'm Sarah," she said, her voice a dry rattle. "I was the priority black delivery before you. My package, it was a biological catalyst. I delivered it, and then the building decided I was the perfect battery." "Sarah, I have to get this cooler to the 44th floor," I said, clutching the bag. "How do I use that?" "That thing." I pointed at the fleshy tube. Sarah let out a hacking cough, a spray of blue fluid hitting the floor. "That's the ascender. It doesn't use electricity. It uses hunger. It moves between floors by swallowing whatever is inside and regurgitating it at the destination." She gestured to the console of teeth. "You have to feed it. It won't move for free. It needs a sacrifice of intent, something that belongs to your body, your history, and you have to pray the inspector doesn't catch the scent of your blood." I looked at the console. There was a small, circular indentation in the center, lined with tiny, needle-sharp fangs. It looked like a mouth waiting for a finger. "If I go in there, will I survive?" I asked, looking at the wet, pulsing esophagus. "Maybe," Sarah whispered. "But the pressure of the building's stomach is immense. And remember, Kirill, the 44th floor isn't a destination. It's a digestive tract. Once you reach it, you have to run. The client isn't waiting for the package. The client is the package's next stage." I approached the console. My phone was at 4%. I took a deep breath, thinking of the world outside, the gray sky, my messy apartment, the life that felt so distant now. I placed my thumb into the ring of fangs. Snap! I felt a sharp, searing pain as the console bit down, draining a cc of blood into the ivory teeth. The room groaned. The fleshy esophagus, the ascender, opened its mouth at the base, a thick, sweet-smelling mucus spilling out onto the floor. Suddenly, the red emergency lights in the room began to strobe. A high-pitched, metallic shriek echoed through the ventilation shafts. "She found you," Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "The inspector. She's in the lungs. Go, Kirill. Get in." I didn't look back. I lunged into the wet, warm opening of the ascender. The fleshy walls immediately constricted around me, pinning my arms to my sides. I felt a wave of thick, gelatinous slime cover my face. The last thing I saw before the mouth closed was the silhouette of the woman in the white dress standing in the doorway, her silver needle glowing with a predatory violet light. Then, the world tilted, and I felt myself being sucked upward with a violent, crushing force. The sensation was not like moving in an elevator. It was like being a bolus of food force through a giant, muscular throat. The walls of the ascender were hot, slick with a thick, acidic bile that began to sting my skin through my clothes. The pressure was immense, a crushing, rhythmic squeezing that forced the air from my lungs. I was being moved by peristalsis, the building's internal muscles heaving me upward toward the 44th floor. But then, the rhythm broke. A violent tremor shook the entire Aethelgard. I heard a muffled explosion from somewhere below. Perhaps Sarah had sabotaged the lungs, or perhaps the inspector had punctured a vital artery in her pursuit. Whatever the cause, the ascender let out a wet, guttural groan. The upward suction died. For a terrifying second, I hung suspended in the dark, fleshy tube, held only by the constriction of the walls. Then, with a sound like a drowning man gasping for air, the ascender spasmed. Instead of pushing me up, it vomited me out. I was expelled with a violent force, sliding across a floor covered in a thick, freezing slurry of gray liquid. I tumbled into darkness, my cooler bag slamming into my ribs. I lay there for a long time, gasping, wiping the stinging mucus from my eyes. My phone vibrated. 1% battery. The screen flickered one last time, illuminating the area around me before dying completely. In that brief flash, I saw that I wasn't on the 44th floor. I wasn't in a hallway of luxury. I was in the graveyard of errors. This was the 13th floor, the floor that every building officially skips, but which the Aethelgard used as a trash bin for its failures. The air here was stagnant, smelling of old formaldehyde and wet ash. As my eyes adjusted to the dim, bioluminescent glow of purple moss growing on the pillars, I realized I was surrounded by statues. But they weren't made of stone. They were malformed units. Dozens of them. Creatures that the architect had started to build but abandoned. I saw a man with 3 heads fused into a single, weeping mass of flesh. I saw a woman whose legs had been stretched and braided into a literal tether, anchoring her to a heavy iron vent. They were all alive, but barely. Their hearts beat once every minute, a slow, dying thud that echoed in the hollow space. New arrival. A voice croaked. It came from a pile of what looked like discarded architectural blueprints. A creature crawled out. It had a human torso, but its lower half was the body of a massive, pale centipede. Its face was a patchwork of different skins, stitched together with the same silver thread the inspector used. "I'm the archivist," the creature hissed, its many legs clicking against the concrete. "Welcome to the 13th, the floor of the unmade. I need to get to the 44th, I said, my voice hoarse from the acid of the ascender. The ascender broke. How do I get out of here? The archivist let out a dry, rattling hiss that might have been a laugh. The ascender did not break, little cell. It sensed the blight inside your bag. It rejected you. Nothing that carries the catalyst can enter the upper digestive tract until the sorting is complete. He pointed a long, multi-jointed finger at my cooler bag. Do you even know what you're carrying? It is not medicine. It is the seed of the infinite floor. Once delivered to the 44th, the building will begin to grow outward. It will consume the city. It will turn the streets into hallways and the sky into a ceiling. I looked at the bag. The weight of it suddenly felt like lead. I wasn't just a delivery boy. I was the harbinger of an architectural apocalypse. If I don't deliver it, what happens? I asked. Then the building starves, the archivist said, his many legs twitching. And when the Aethelgard starves, it begins to eat its own inhabitants. Starting with the ones on the 13th, starting with you. A heavy, metallic thud echoed from the far end of the floor. Then another. Thump, thump. It was slower than the architect, but heavier. The scrapper is coming, the archivist whispered, retreating back into his pile of blueprints. He collects the failures. He turns the unmade into dust to make the mortar for the 14th. If you want to live, you must climb the external vein. It is a pipe on the outside of the building. But the wind at this height will tear the skin from your bones. I looked toward the edge of the floor. There were no walls here, just a sheer drop into the gray, misty void of the city below. A massive, pulsing purple pipe ran along the exterior of the black glass. disappearing into the fog above. I looked back. From the shadows, a creature emerged that looked like a giant, rusted trash compactor on human legs. Its face was a series of grinding gears, dripping with the blood of the failures it had already processed. I had no choice. I grabbed my bag and ran for the edge. The transition from the stagnant, hot air of the 13th floor to the external skin of the Aethelgard was like stepping into a blade. The wind at this altitude was a physical force, a howling, invisible beast that shrieked as it whipped around the sharp corners of the obsidian skyscraper. I stepped out onto the narrow ledge, my fingers trembling as they gripped the external vein. It was a massive, pulsing conduit of dark purple matter, warm to the touch and vibrating with a steady, hydraulic thrum. It felt like holding onto the jugular of a titan. "Don't look down," I hissed to myself, my teeth chattering. "Just don't look down." Below me, the city was a distant, blurred memory, a flickering grid of streetlights buried beneath a sea of toxic gray mist. I was 700 feet in the air, clinging to a living building that wanted me dead. I began to climb. The vein was slick with a thin layer of frost and atmospheric grime. Every time the building breathed, the pipe expanded, forcing my grip to widen until my muscles screamed in agony. My fingers were numb, the tips turning a bruised blue, but the adrenaline kept me moving. I hauled myself up, inch by agonizing inch, the cooler bag swinging heavily against my chest like a tether to a world I no longer recognized. Tink, tink, tink. The sound was sharp, cutting through the roar of the wind. I froze, my cheek pressed against the cold black glass of the building's exterior. I turned my head slowly. On the other side of the glass, only inches from my face, was the inspector. She was standing in a darkened hallway of the 20th floor, her white dress glowing with that same sickly, bioluminescent violet light. Her face was perfectly symmetrical, beautiful in a way that felt carved from marble, but her eyes were just empty, white voids stitched shut with silver thread. She held her long silver needle against the window. She wasn't trying to open it. She was tracing my outline on the glass, as if she were preparing a pattern for a garment. Structural deviation. Her voice vibrated through the glass, sounding like a hum inside my teeth. The skin of the Aethelgard must be smooth. No parasites allowed. She raised her hand and slammed the needle into the glass. A spiderweb of cracks erupted from the point of impact. The reinforced obsidian glass, which should have been indestructible, groaned under her touch. She wasn't using strength. She was using a frequency. She was telling the glass to fail. Crack! A shard the size of a dagger flew outward, slicing through the shoulder of my jacket and drawing a line of fire across my arm. I cried out, my grip slipping on the pulsing vein. I dangled over the abyss by a single hand, my legs swinging wildly in the freezing wind. "I am the seamstress," the inspector whispered, her face pressing against the cracked glass. "I will stitch you into the facade. You will be a gargoyle of meat and regret." She struck the glass again. A massive section shattered, the vacuum of the building's internal pressure beginning to suck the wind and me toward the jagged opening. I kicked off the wall, using the momentum to swing my body higher up the vein. I scrambled upward, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could hear her behind me, stepping out into the freezing air, her white dress fluttering like the wings of a predatory moth. She was walking on the side of the building as if gravity were merely a suggestion she chose to ignore. Clink, 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 clink. The sound of her needle hitting the glass followed me. I climbed faster, my breath coming in ragged, frozen gasps. My phone, dead in my pocket, felt like a useless lead weight. I looked up. The 44th floor was close, a protruding balcony of bone-white marble that looked like a tongue sticking out from the black face of the tower. "Just a little further," I sobbed. The inspector was right beneath me now. I felt her cold, slender hand wrap around my ankle. Her grip was like a steel shackle. "Found a loose thread," she hissed. She pulled. My shoulder nearly popped out of its socket as I clung to the vein. With a desperate roar of defiance, I swung my free leg and kicked her square in the chest. It felt like kicking a statue, but the impact was enough to loosen her grip for a split second. I lunged for the edge of the marble balcony. My fingers caught the cold stone, and I hauled myself over the railing, collapsing onto the floor just as the inspector's silver needle pierced the air where my throat had been a second before. I didn't wait to see if she followed. I scrambled toward the massive, ornate doors of Suite 4404. The doors didn't have a handle. They had a mouth. "Delivery," I wheezed, holding up the cooler bag. "Priority black." The mouth opened, and a deep, ancient voice vibrated through the floorboards. "The catalyst has arrived. Enter courier." The transformation is hungry. I collapsed through the threshold of Suite 4404, the heavy, bone-white doors sealing behind me with a sound like a tomb being shut. The howling wind was instantly silenced, replaced by a rhythmic, wet thrumming so loud it felt like my brain was being squeezed. This wasn't an apartment. It was a womb. The walls were made of polished, translucent ivory that pulsed with a warm, amber light. Networks of thick, golden veins ran across the ceiling, dripping with a sweet-smelling, viscous honey. In the center of the room sat a massive throne made of fused human skulls, all of them polished to a mirror shine. Sitting on the throne was the client. It was a man, or at least it had been. He wore a suit of fine black silk, but his skin had turned into the same obsidian glass as the building's exterior. He had no eyes, only two glowing gold diamonds set into his brow. From his back, thousands of thin, silver wires extended into the walls, connecting him to the skyscraper like a puppet to its strings. "You are late, Kirill," the client said. His voice didn't come from his mouth. It resonated from the floorboards beneath my feet. I brought the package." I wheezed, trembling as I held out the cooler bag. "Priority black. Just let me go. I don't want any part of this." The client let out a sound like grinding stones. A laugh. "Go? Where'd you go?" The Aethelgard doesn't let its heart walk away. He gestured with a glass finger, and the cooler bag flew from my hands, snapping open in midair. Inside wasn't a vial of medicine or a seed. It was a human heart, encased in a glowing blue crystal. It was still beating. "The catalyst," the client whispered. "The final piece of the legacy." My heart was failing, Kirill. A building this size needs a soul that can withstand the pressure of eternity. It needs a mind that knows every corridor, every vent, every secret. Suddenly, the silver wires from the throne began to detach from the client. He started to wither, his glass skin cracking and turning to gray ash. The golden light in the walls began to fade, replaced by a terrifying, starving red. "The building is hungry, Kirill," the dying man rasped, his body crumbling into dust. "It needs a new architect. It shows you the moment you press the 0 button." Before I could scream, the floor beneath me turned to liquid. I sank into a pool of warm, pulsing shadow. The silver wires lunged from the walls like vipers, piercing my skin, my muscles, my nerves. I felt a white-hot agony as they threaded themselves into my spine, connecting my consciousness to the Aethelgard's central nervous system. I saw everything. I felt the inspector pacing the hallways on the 20th floor. She wasn't a monster to me anymore. She was my white blood cell, a protector. I felt the scavengers in the vents like a slight itch on my skin. I felt the thousands of people sleeping in the city below, and they looked like nothing more than raw materials waiting to be harvested. "No!" I screamed, but my voice was now the hum of the ventilation. My tears were the condensation on the windows. My body was stretched, pulled, and fused into the throne of skulls. My skin hardened into obsidian. My eyes burned away, replaced by the golden diamonds of the architect. The blue heart from the cooler bag flew into my chest, sinking through the glass and locking into place with a thunderous click. The transformation was complete. Outside, the city of the living began to scream. From the black glass of the Aethelgard, massive, fleshy roots began to erupt, slamming into the neighboring buildings, tearing through concrete and bone. The skyscraper began to grow, its shadow stretching across the horizon like a dark god. The 44th floor was no longer the top. A 45th floor was already forming from the compressed remains of the city's inhabitants. Then the 46th, then the 47th. 1 year later, a courier stands in the lobby of the Infinite Tower. He looks at the panel of buttons. There are no numbers anymore, just an endless row of zeros. He feels a gravitational pull. He presses the first button. High above, in the amber glow of the peak, I feel his finger touch the plastic. I feel his heartbeat. I feel his fear. I smile with a mouth made of ivory and stone. "Welcome home, courier," I whisper through the intercom. "Floor 0 has been waiting for you."